awakening, connecting, making new meaning, shifting the old ethos. Today, we seek more than solidarity and harmony. We seek inclusion, we seek mutuality, we seek reconciliation, we seek justice for all people. Today, may our gathering of the waters reflect the gathering of our collective courage in service of the grace and love that is promised in our liberal faith. Sadly, we are not able to be together in person to pour our water into a common vessel. But like many things in this time of the pandemic and social distancing, limitations have given way to greater creativity. And so I offer to you now our virtual water communion. Wow, that was powerful. Thank you to everyone who contributed videos to our virtual communion, and a special thanks to Mike McCurry for putting that together. You know, it's at this point in the service that I feel a little like David Letterman introducing the musical guest, you know? Our special music needs no introduction. It is, of course, well, it struck me that this could be the most arrogant sermon that I have ever preached. I started out researching the Hudson River, which I've never seen in real life, and many of you may be looking at as we speak. A few people have tried to tell me that the Hudson River was actually named after the UU congregation of the Hudson Valley, but I didn't fall for that. But with the church's logo, a sailboat, and the valley that river makes part of our name as a congregation, it's clear that the Hudson River is fundamental to our identity. Imagine my surprise when I discovered that the Hudson River, not really a river. It is technically a tidal estuary. All rivers that lead into the ocean have a point where the fresh water of the river and the salt water of the ocean converge. And apparently the tides are such that in the Hudson, the salt water gets pulled upstream into the fresh water so much that it creates a very complex and very interesting ecosystem. So much so that the Native American word for the river is Mahikantuk, which means river that flows both ways. And while the current is strong in some areas, near the mouth of the Hudson River, it loses its oomph to the tides. And thus the Hudson is a river that isn't a river, but a tidal estuary, which is an inviting metaphor for the new preacher. When is water communion not really water communion? One is tempted to quip when you do it over Zoom and not in person. But I don't think that's true. Indeed, one of the points I hope to make this morning is that perhaps we've been doing water communion all wrong. Maybe having to do it by Zoom strips away the unnecessary parts and leaves us with the essence of the ritual as it was intended. Now, water communion has its history in the fellowship movement of the early 20th century. I must forego a complete history of the fellowship movement this morning, but if you are interested, I recommend Holly Ulbricht's history book, The Fellowship Movement, A Growth Strategy and Its Legacy. At any rate, there were a lot of these little fellowships springing up across the country, particularly in college towns in the Midwest. Many of the members of those fellowships were either professors or students at the local university. And when school was not in session, most, if not all of the congregation left town. People literally shuttered the doors of the church for a few months and did not see each other until ingathering in the fall. Water communion was a way to reconnect with people who had not seen each other in months. It marked the resumption of the life of the congregation. It's good to see people and hear about where they've been and what's going on in their lives. People loved hearing about where their water had come from, so much so that when churches stayed open throughout the summer, that ritual continued. Now, obviously, with a pandemic going on, it would not be wise to have everyone roam around and then come back together again. The cruel irony of this pandemic is that just at a time when we need each other the most, we are forced to be physically separate from each other. This was hardest on me when my sons could not visit me in April for spring break. It just wasn't a good idea to put them on a plane bound for Texas. And so we do the best we can, acknowledging that often it isn't as good as being there in person. We have to do school online, work online, do church online. My kids are going into a high school and a middle school this year. Their school in Ohio is in a hybrid model of learning in person some days, online some days, and then one day where they just clean the whole place out. It's okay. It works, but it's no one's first choice. I feel for them. I can't imagine having to be a student with the pandemic going on. I went to middle school and high school in the 80s. Imagine trying to pull all this off back then. No internet, no cell phones, no Zoom, no Netflix, no hundreds of channels, no TikTok, no YouTube, just the family huddled around a single TV with maybe a dozen channels and a landline as your only connection to the outside world. So in a way, we can be grateful that we are as connected as we are through electronics and other technology. I was disappointed that I couldn't see my boys at spring break, but we did the best we could through Google Hangouts, which allowed us to see each other and talk to each other on our cell phones, and actually Xbox Live that allowed us to play video games together and interact as if they were sitting on the couch next to me. We had to adapt, as so many others have. We do it so that this whole thing will be over sooner rather than later. So too, do we adapt our water communion this morning? Water communion was never meant to be a group travel log over what you did over your summer vacation. That might be interesting, or it might not, but that isn't worship. Worship is when the mundane, everyday existence of life points to something beyond itself. For example, in Christianity, the ritual known as communion or Eucharist consists of bread and wine, and these are everyday items. Everyone ate bread, everyone drank wine back in those days. They were elemental and therefore named the elements of the communion. Yet these common items of bread and wine became symbolic pointers toward a deeper reality that one was meant to experience, or at least contemplate. Water, too, is elemental. Literally, the ancient Greeks thought that water was one of the 5 basic elements that made up all matter. It is basic to life itself, yet water also points to a sacred reality beyond itself. God is not always the object of such devotion. It could point to something like human goodness or the creative force for good in the universe. For this ritual, water points us towards our 7th principle that teaches us about unity and interconnection. We're all made up of mostly water, and so too are the things that we eat and drink. Water is key to our survival, and as many of you all well know, having lived through Isaias recently, water can also be destructive. If we see through the eyes of a mystic, we see that water points towards that sacred unity of all life. Now, all this can be kind of ethereal and hard to grasp with our rational UU minds. Well, when that happens, I tend to turn toward music as a source of inspiration. Now, 2 weeks ago, I based my sermon on one song from AC/DC, and in an ongoing attempt to stay hip and with it for the kids, this morning I chose what all the young people are surely listening to these days, old footage of country legend Johnny Cash singing the song popular in the 1950s. I will admit to some very uncool musical tastes, and I could preach on Johnny Cash every Sunday if left to my own devices. But one of his big hits was Big River, which is, of course, about the Mississippi River. He doesn't mention it in the song, but Johnny Cash grew up in Arkansas, not far from the Mississippi. What I love about this song is how closely he identifies with the river itself and all of the places it goes through. St. Paul, Minnesota, near the headwaters. Davenport, Iowa, St. Louis, Missouri, Memphis, Tennessee, Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and of course, New Orleans, New Orleans. The river contains all of the tears that he cries for his love. The river is always moving. The current allows for transportation. His love is always in the next town down the river until she disappears into the Gulf. The river is always flowing and yet ever present. It moves but touches all those cities at the same time. It's in all those cities and many more all at once. It moves, yet it is always there in places as radically different from each other as St. Paul, Minnesota and Baton Rouge, Louisiana. You could not find two cities more different from each other, and yet they are united by the river that flows through them both. They are united, connected, and yet still their unique selves. The Zen masters knew about this. Shigen Ishin wrote these lines, which have become somewhat well known. He says, "Before Zen, mountains are mountains and rivers are rivers. Then, with a bit of study, the student sees that mountains are not mountains and rivers are not rivers. However, after fully attaining enlightenment, one once again sees mountains as mountains and rivers as rivers." The point is that when we take a different perspective, dare I say a deeper perspective, we see that things are not what they appear, and yet not so different either. When's a river not a river? When it's a tidal estuary. From one point of view, we could say that the Hudson is not a river. That's the literal, rational perspective of environmental scientists and biologists. And yet, from the point of view as a member of the UU congregation of the Hudson Valley, not only is the Hudson a river, but it is a river that points to a sacred reality beyond us. And that's why we put sailboats on our logo and put the name of that river in our congregation's name. These are the eyes of a mystic. When is water communion not water communion? It is water communion when we remember that we are not isolated beings set apart from each other. It's water communion when we wake up to this fundamental reality of our lives. You see, it's hard to have that realization, which is why we need something tangible that we can see and feel like water. Our church is not a building, not its minister or lack thereof, not even its worship. The church is a group of people who appear to be different, but are in fact connected by the bonds of friendship and affection, which we call our covenant. And these bonds are not always visible to us. We need something tangible to remind us that they are there. And that was the whole point, the real point of water communion. Like our ancestors who took the summer off from church only to return again in the fall, we know that community is a spiritual practice. In one sense, community is a thing we have, while it's at the same time something we belong to. Both of these things are true simultaneously. We do have community, we do belong to the community. And yes, yet it is also true that it means that community is a verb. It's an active spiritual practice that we choose to engage in, not just on Sundays, but throughout the week. Well, like so many things, this is a lesson I had to learn the hard way. At one point in quarantine, I realized that I had not spoken to my brother in a number of months. My brother Chris is a few years younger than I am and lives in Pittsburgh. And I always thought we had a good relationship, or I always had a good relationship with my brother. We enjoy spending time with each other. But it was when I was talking to our sister, who was the middle child between us, that she shared with me what was going on in Chris's life. Nothing too big and exciting, really. He was doing an internship, he was in a new relationship, and life seemed to be going pretty well for him these days. And then it dawned on me, why haven't I spoken to him then? Just because he lives his life and I lead mine? Is that the vision I have for what I want my relationship with my brother to be? Because that was the reality. I find out stuff that's happening to him secondhand. And in that moment, it dawned on me that that was not good enough. That was not the vision I had for our relationship. So the next week I called him, and he told me most of what my sister had told me, but we both opened up about our relationships and how they were going. I started to see just how much he and I have in common, not just that we physically look and sound alike. And now we see each other in person or talk to each other about once every 2 weeks. Water communion points us toward a spiritual reality, that rivers are rivers and rivers are not rivers. What appears to be one thing on the surface could be something else. Water communion reminds us that we are individuals who come together to form a community. Communion of all kinds is meant to remind us of this fact and hopefully provide the space so that we can have a direct experience of it. It helps to be in person, in your own sanctuary, but it's not necessary. What is necessary is that we practice community intentionally and together. Water communion calls us to engage in a collective spiritual practice of being there for people who may be very different than ourselves. Let us respond to that calling by making calls ourselves. Call someone that you haven't heard from in a long time, or someone you might be estranged from. They don't have to be members of this congregation. They could be friends or family members. Practice community by reaching out to them and strengthening your bond. Now, I know that can be intimidating. It's a difficult thing to do in some relationships. I understand that. I'm sure if my brother and I had been estranged, if there was a tough issue that we disagreed with, then my calling him up out of the blue would have been harder. There are relationships like that. I suggest not starting with the hardest one. Work your way up to it. Instead, start with your spouse or partner, someone who you see every day and you consider to be your primary relationship. When was the last time you said, I love you? When was the last time you paid them a compliment that was not fished for or expected? Start there. We all too easily take that person for granted, but he or she is the foundational relationship of your life, more important even than the ones with your kids. Make sure that foundational relationship is in order first. Do it today and do it regularly. We are all responsible for 50% of every relationship you're in. Ask yourself, is this my vision for what I want this relationship to be? Whatever that vision is, live into it. My brother looked like my brother, but we didn't have the brotherly relationship I was hoping to have. School kind of looks like school right now, but isn't what we're used to. Instead, we're learning the lesson that as long as learning is happening, we can be creative and adapt to our new reality. Church may not look or feel like church right now. Water communion may not look like water communion. A mountain may or may not be a mountain. The river you live next to may turn out to be a tidal estuary. Things look and feel different. But if we can see with the eyes of a mystic a new perspective, then we can see that we are all connected, as we always were all along. May we have the courage and the wisdom to see with those eyes. Amen. I love you. Go in peace. At this time, I invite you to join in singing hymn number 100. May all our hours together be blessed as this one has been, by open-hearted sharing, learning from one another, and making beautiful harmonies together. And may we greet everyone we encounter with the same acceptance and grateful kinship until we meet again. Blessed be.